Hello and welcome to the third video on one of my all-time favorite airplanes, the E-flite 1.3m Cherokee. So this is the new and improved version. If you remember from my previous two videos, the first one was all the things that they've done to make this aircraft new and improved compared to the old red and white one. Improvements such as the landing gear, the horizontal stabilator, as well as a few other upgrades here and there to make this even better than it was before. Second video focused on how to set the airplane up for flying, how to make sure everything is ready to go. This video is going to focus a little bit more on my favorite part of the hobby, which is the modeling aspect, right? Taking the aircraft and making them a little bit more like a realistic airplane, making them a little bit more like a flying scale model rather than just a regular old RC plane. And so to do that, it spent a little bit of time with some research and kind of learning the history on the Piper Cherokee, and really trying to figure out how to best apply that to this new Cherokee to kind of give it what I'm calling like an OEM plus. And by that, I mean, I'm taking the airplane, I'm keeping the original factory scheme to it. I'm not doing a full repaint, but I'm adding additional scale details, some, weathering or paint, whatever it may be, just to take the airplane, take it up one notch above the way it comes out of the box. And as you can see here, the factory paint scheme is still here. I did this on my P47. I've done this on the my T28. Done it even on my one of my Corsairs as well. Keep the factory scheme, but just try to amp it up just a little bit, and that's what I call OEM plus. So when it comes out of the box, this is a Piper Cherokee 160 meaning 160 horsepower engine on it, and it's an early, pretty much an early model Cherokee. Nothing really too unique or special about it in that aspect, but I wanted to kind of do something different anyway, right? So I wanted to kind of do that OEM plus approach. So I decided I'm going to make this a Cherokee 180, meaning it has a 180 horsepower engine. It's got more power. It actually is now the same Cherokee 180 that my other E-flite Cherokees repainted up as, 5.8 Juliet. That's a 180C variant. But since I already had a 180C with the complete repaint, I want to do something just a little bit different as well for this one. So when I started looking into 180Cs or Cherokee 180s, I realized that it's kind of interesting to know that the front cowl shape varies on year. So the original Cherokee 180 in 1962-63 time frame had the same cowl as the 140, the 160. The Cherokee 140, 140 horsepower engine, no rear seat in it, great type of a trainer. That's really what it was meant for, almost like a Cessna 150. Lower horsepower, no rear seats, and really designed for more for flight training. So I didn't want to do a 140. It was already a 160, so I wanted to do the 180. But to do a 180, it had to be a 62 or 63. Right around 64, 65 time frame, they changed the cowl design. They made the air intake around the propeller different. The shape of that is different. The shape of the bottom of the cowl is completely different. And the exhaust pipe went from a single exit at the rear of the cowl to a dual exit that has a fairing around it, as well as the landing light changed as well. So there was a number of things that went on the nose of this thing, that if I was going to make it a 180, I was going to have to make it a 62 or 63 vintage. So easy enough. I added the single exhaust pipe down at the bottom there, and then weathered that to make it look like it obviously has some use on it. Got a hold of Callie Graphics. Callie made me new Cherokee 180 badges for the cowl. And then I also, while I was doing this, I noticed that the new prop, the updated prop, and the original prop from the version 1 of the Cherokee, neither of those two really looked right or looked scale correct. The Cherokee's has a squared tip on the prop, and the size of the prop just wasn't quite right. The original one was way too big, too large of a diameter. It had a rounded tip and was a very slender type of a prop. And I'm like, well, that's I know it'll work on this airplane, but that's not really scale correct either. So then I looked at the new prop, And the new prop is a smaller diameter, but much wider towards the center by the spinner. And that didn't look scale correct either. So I ended up finding, I spent a lot of time digging through a lot of props, and I found this prop here, which is scale-wise almost exactly the right diameter for the airplane. And then Callie also made me some Macaulay prop stickers on there. I painted the tip swipe. The only problem is I have not determined if I can actually fly on that prop yet. I think it's an 11-inch prop, I think, and I think I went from a 10-inch to an 11, and I think the version 1 is a 12-inch prop. So I kind of split the difference there, but I have not tested that prop to measure if it's going to be okay with this motor and ESC. So kind of a word of caution there. Yes, the prop is different. Yes, it is more scale correct. Yes, I love the looks of it, but I don't know if I can actually fly on that. So I got to do some homework yet before I go ahead and make that happen. So worst case scenario, I'll put on the factory prop and just fly on that. Factory prop doesn't look too bad, but at least for the point of this video and taking the still pictures, I wanted to make sure that I had a more scale accurate looking prop on there. Moving back from there, the next area that I really logged a ton of time on, in fact I spent months on it, the cockpit. That's an area that I'm having a lot of fun on lately. Really getting into and detailing and making the cockpit look far more realistic. And with scale general aviation airplanes such as the Cherokee or the Cirrus, we have all this clear greenhouse. You have a lot of opportunity to look inside there, and because of that, it was the right opportunity to take it apart and really do something special to it. The version 2 Cherokee already had an updated pilot in it, which looked a ton better than the original, and then also has a plastic covering over the instrument panel that prevents the foam from kind of gatoring or bubbling up. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm basing this airplane on a 62-63 vintage Cherokee 180. The early Cherokees had a different shaped instrument panel than the later ones. They actually had a raised center hump in the instrument panel that this particular model doesn't have. So if I was to replicate the instrument panel correctly from a 60s vintage Cherokee, I was going to have my work cut out for me to try to kind of reshape the instrument panel. And I decided, you know what, that's maybe a bit of a bridge too far for me. So I decided to not do that and decided to go with the 1970s and 80s vintage traditional steam gauges instrument panel for a Cherokee. So a couple things on that. So that's the instrument panel that I most identify with. That's the same panel that was in my grandfather's all of his arrows. It's the same one that was in the Warrior that I have flown with my dad, and I've flown in multiple different aircraft. They all have that same instrument panel. The one that I fly in Microsoft Flight Simulator, the Archer, the Cherokees, the Arrows, they all have that same instrument panel. So for me, that's the instrument panel that I most identify with the PA-28. And also, it was the easiest to conform to the instrument panel that came from the factory. So once again, Callie helped me out. She did a instrument panel. She actually kind of adjusted the shape and proportions a little bit so that it would fit perfectly in the Cherokee model. And then I used Future floor wax, which is high gloss and clear, to paint over all the gauges so that they would have gloss to them. So if you move around and look at the instrument panel, you can watch and see the light reflecting off of all the different gauges, which kind of makes it look pretty cool. It gives it a little bit of a almost three-dimensional look there, because you see the matte finish of the black, and then you see the gloss finish of the gauges. So it adds just a little bit of something of optical interest to that. So I created that, and then I got looking at the pilot, and I noticed that the new pilot looks a ton better than the original, but he sits up very high in the airplane. And it also looks like his arms are almost straight down at his side, like where his elbows would bend are too high up in the fuselage. So it didn't look like he was actually sitting in the seat and had his hands out holding onto the yoke. So that made me do some thinking about how can I come up with a pilot and co-pilot that looked a little bit more realistic. Thankfully, didn't have to look too far. The E-flite RV7 has a pilot in it that has his arms out that looked more like like he's got his hand on the flight yokes. And sits a little bit lower in the cockpit. He's got his arms on him. He's got a general aviation style headset and hat. So I decided I'll go ahead and get that pilot. But I still had this height issue where I had now the co-pilot was much higher than the pilot. So I cut the torso down on the co-pilot, lowered him down. I also realized that the skin coloring was still a little light, so I repainted the skin color. I actually repainted it on both pilot and co-pilot. Detailed up the headsets. I also realized that the headset for the RV7 pilot is missing the earpiece for the left side. So I 3D printed a headset, so you have a complete set. And then because I mostly identify David Clark headsets as the headset that most people would have flown with, and that's what my dad had, and that's what I always identify with, even though a lot of people today probably use Bose or something else. David Clarks are the type that I like the look of that classic color. So spent about a month going through every shade of green I could possibly find anywhere on the planet, and eventually found the closest green possible, and I painted up the headset to make them match. Because I wanted to kind of make this there's some modern pieces of this, so it's not period correct 1960s throughout the entire thing, right? We already talked about the instrument panel is not. I wanted to put the more modern shoulder harnesses in there that you can get from their aftermarket. They plug into the rear seat, and I decided to go with the shoulder harnesses, and those are actually 1/10 scale RC car harnesses that have been cut down and modified to work with the pilots. So I have my pilots, I got them in there, and I have their pilot's got his hands out like there's supposed to be a yoke there, but there was no yoke. So the early Cherokees had what was kind of referred to as the pretzel shaped yoke. It was kind of almost like a figure eight or a pretzel shape, and very, very thin. The problem is with that style is as the airplanes are now 50, 60 years old, that style began to crack and break down. And so a lot of pilots ended up replacing those with the more modern kind of the U-shape yoke, which is the yoke that I'm also most familiar with. Also for me, it's the easiest to design in 3D CAD. So I was going to do the pretzel shaped one, but then I decided, you know what, the U-shaped one is even easier for me to draw, and I'm using a new CAD system that I had never used before to make all the parts for this thing. So I stuck with something simple. I made the yokes for both the pilot side and co-pilot side, modified the arms on the pilot so that his hands are actually now on the yoke, and then added the throttle and mixture control knobs as well. So now the interior is really starting to come together, and because this is a Cherokee 180 and not a 140, it needed a rear seat. So designed up a rear seat, had it 3D printed, painted it. I painted actually all the seats in here. They're intermediate blue with Cherokee blue. I actually matched this blue out here on the wing and fuselage, and I painted part of the seat that color as well to kind of give it some depth. Also moving through the cockpit, I added the temperature probe to the top, and of course I have the you can't see it on this side though, but I have the side window that you open for ventilation and to yell clear when you start the engine. It's also got the black around the door opening for kind of representing the kind of the panel line there around the door. I 3D printed a hatch lever that goes on the very top. We have our antennas up here as well that were borrowed from other projects. I have the grab handle back here that is actually from the Cirrus. And I gotta say, the E-flite Cirrus, that plastics kit is something you should, if you're in the general aviation, you like scale parts, I would get a couple of those and just keep them on hand because they're full of all sorts of little odds and ends that you can modify, cut, and add to work, including the footstep down here as well. That's the Cirrus footstep. I use that on all my Cherokees. But a functional thing that I added to the cockpit is up here, this roof scoop. So early Cherokees had a cabin air extraction vent that was located up on top of the roof. Later models, 70s vintage on up, they actually have back here along the fuselage is where the vents are, but on the early models it was actually up on top. So after doing all this work to the interior and having all this greenhouse up here, you can get a lot of heat that can generate inside here, and that heat can damage the foam. So this scoop up here is actually functional. I drilled a hole through the top of the canopy here, and this scoop is open so that it will actually help you get the hot air out of there. And of course, while I'm flying as well, it will actually, as the air passes over it, it will help suck some of the warm air out of the cockpit. To finish up the cockpit, I added the sun visors in here using really ultra thin polycarbonate that was painted with Tamiya tin spray, and I just glued those into place. I took went on eBay, found a set that was available for sale. I printed out a copy of the picture and scaled it correctly, cut it out to the clear polycarbonate, and glued that in place. The other advantage of doing that is it's actually a little bit of a functional sunshade, just like the scoop up here, in the sense that as the sun comes through, the very top part of the windscreen here has a tinted piece over it, which should hopefully reduce some of the sunlight going in there. So the cockpit, like I said, a lot of fun doing that. I mean, I spent way too many hours researching every part of the cockpit and then trying to figure out how to replicate it. But I think the end result came out pretty good. Oh, one last thing, I do have the compass up on top of the instrument panel as well. Sometimes they're mounted on that center pillar. Other times they're mounted on top of the instrument panel. Because this is somewhat flexible and moves around, I didn't want to glue too many things already to that plastic up here, and because it's on the inside, I was afraid that if it ever worked itself loose, it would be loose inside the cockpit, where if any of the outside pieces came loose, I could easily just glue them back on. So I decided to glue it to the instrument panel as well. Cherokees have them in both locations, so it's not as if I was terribly wrong by doing that. Moving on from there, on the top of the wing is the wing walk area. And if you see my earlier videos on how to make your Cherokee more realistic, you've seen that I use sandpaper for that. The sandpaper looks remarkably legit because the real ones are kind of like that skateboard grip tape. You know, it's an anti-slip tape. So it's in sandpaper, especially the finer grades, like 1,000 grit or 1,200 grit, have that same type of a texture to them. The only problem is that they are impossible to keep clean. After a few years of hanging in the garage, you get dust and dirt and pollen and just crud built up on top there, and there's no way to wash it off. If you run a paper towel across it to clean it, the paper towel breaks apart and sticks to it. So for this one, I decided to do something different. I found some textured matte black vinyl, and I put the matte black vinyl down on top of the wing instead of the gloss, because the gloss doesn't really look realistic. So I used a matte, and then I took sandpaper and I actually sanded down the walk area so you can see where the rivets kind of poke through the grip tape and where the panel lines are, and that's where on the real ones you see you get the wear from coming in and out of the cabin door, down along the wing, and then onto the step. Moving back, I have I upgraded the Piper logos on the side. They had the more modern logo on there, and I decided that while I like the new modern logo, it's cool and all, but I'm trying to make this a little bit more of a 60s vintage, a little bit more of a classic Cherokee. So I had Callie get me some dark blue Piper decals that's in the 1960s font. I added an extra aerial antenna on the back here. Just happened to have one laying around the parts bin. Don't even remember exactly where that one came from. I then have a little tiny ELT antenna back here. And then I also replaced the tail, the registration numbers, with some that were a little bit bigger and a little bit more kind of brighter. So they're bright white with a red backdrop on them, so it kind of broke up some of the chunkiness of the fuselage here. I thought the factory registration numbers were a little too small for the Cherokee, and I wanted to go something bigger and something that looked a little bit more scale correct. So Callie helped me out there as well and got me some new tail letters. And then lastly, there's just a couple little minor things here and there. I added some of the nomenclature decals for the no step, the do not push decals, the little flap warning sticker that if the flap's down, it tells you not to step on the flap. And then when I was done with the entire airplane, I coated the entire thing with a couple layers of clear gloss coat as well to really kind of make the airplane pop and make it come to life. And the blue especially, when you put a couple layers of gloss on it, that blue really comes to life. Although a word of warning, so if you have dark blue or dark red, almost any of the dark colors, and you put a high gloss finish on them, be careful in the sunshine. Matte paint doesn't seem to do this, but the gloss especially will popcorn and blister in a very short time. One of my Corsairs did it in about 15-20 minutes of sun exposure. The whole top of the wing bubbled up. My other one that's flat finish sat out in the sun and has never had a problem. But if you use the gloss, it will bubble if you let it sit in the sun. So just be aware of that. Most of the time I flies in the evening. The sun is down low and I don't really have too much of a problem. But if you do use the gloss coat, be advised that you may run into an issue that you get that popcorn effect on here. So do it at your own risk. I love how it looks with the gloss on it, but I know that I'm taking a bit of a gamble on doing that. So, and the very last thing is on the bottom of the pilot's wing here is the pitot tube sticking down there as well. So that's it for the scale details on this. I'm really happy how it came out. I think the OEM approach, the OEM Plus approach works well, especially on the Cherokee, because I really liked this paint scheme. It was kind of the Rossman's Williams F1 color scheme that if you're familiar with vintage racing, that Williams used, and well, actually a lot of race teams used. Porsche used it, even some Fords were painted this color. So it's a very classic looking scheme. It should have good visibility in the air. It fits the Cherokee remarkably well. And the little scale details and little things I did to it really take this airplane for what I thought was pretty darn good out of the box and just kind of amplifies it up just a little bit further. And I think it's going to look really awesome in the air with all this done. So if you guys got any questions at all on how to take your Cherokee to the next level, how to bust it up just a little bit higher, make it look even more realistic, by all means leave them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help out or answer any questions. If you're going to leave a comment about how silly it is for me to waste this much time on a foam airplane, you can just skip that comment, because I'll end up deleting it anyway, because I don't need to hear that. I love doing this kind of stuff. The research, the designing the little scale bits, 3D printing the parts, detailing, painting, all the little work that goes into kind of doing these airplanes is something I absolutely love of the hobby. And it may not be your thing, but don't ruin it for me just because it's not your thing, okay? So with that said, if there's nothing else, I'm going to wrap this one up and get this thing ready to go fly.